Good afternoon. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I have no idea what I'm going to be talking about today, which makes me happy. We'll see whether it makes you happy by the end. Maybe you can help me out by steering the direction of the hour. Is it an hour? Yeah. And expressing an opinion as to what you'd like to cover, or what you'd like me to cover, and what you'd like to talk about. Maybe some of you would like to have a few words. You'll excuse me because I've already been speaking too much today. Right. What I'm going to be talking about is, in a sense, bringing the world of software development a little bit closer together. I think, how many people here would say that they worked in a fractured organization? Okay, that's about a third. And by fractured, I mean an organization that doesn't really work as a whole. You know, there's management versus the workers, and the business versus the technologies, and the business itself versus its customers. And generally, people are not getting on with other people. And coming back to something Alistair introduced his talk this morning around software development being primarily about people. I very much share that view. So I may use a slide later on, or I may not, depending on how well we get. No, I'm going to start out on a flowchart. Sorry, flip chart. And if people at the back can't see it, do let me know, and then I'll just move to the slide. Right, just a very brief introduction to me. I'm Bob Marshall. We've already heard that. And these days, I call myself an organizational psychotherapist. Okay, it's not just me. There are one or two others in the world. But it's a fairly uncommon title. And we may get to the point where I explain why I call myself that. And if we don't get to that point, please, if you're still interested afterwards, do ask me. I'm quite happy to explain it. It's quite straightforward, but maybe you can figure it out for yourselves. Okay, so why do I do this? Why do I talk to rooms full of lovely people? Why do I travel around Europe? Just being at conferences, well, the most immediate reason is because I like meeting people, and I like hearing their stories, and I like making meaningful connections, and in the ideal case, having some mutual exploration of some of the topics that might be of interest to us together. But more broadly, why have I spent most of my career, all of my career, in software development and worrying about and thinking about and talking about software development related things? And it's because maybe 25, 30 years ago, while I had been working in software for some time, it began to dawn on me what a miserable time a lot of the people around me were having on a fairly regular basis, working in the kinds of organizations they were working in. And since then, I don't really see much change. Most people are still having a pretty regularly miserable time at work. And yes, we all have coping strategies. But joy to those few who are the exceptions and really enjoy what they're doing and don't have many aggravations on a daily basis. I reckon that's a very small percentage, maybe of the audience, maybe of the world in general. How many people here regard themselves among that happy few? Okay, Switzerland must be a nice place then. that was about a third. That's far more hands than I normally get for that question. So that's why I'm occupied by the questions of what makes for effective software development. I don't really think the rich people need to be a lot richer. I really don't think the people who own businesses and run businesses really need more productivity. But that argument, or that word productivity may get them to buy into some things which are good for everyone, good for them, good for people working in their companies, and good for society at large, because I do believe that healthy workplaces are a major contributor to healthy societies. And I've always had the impression that Switzerland is a healthy society. Do we have any dissenters to that? Peer pressure. No, but I've always seen Switzerland as a standout for a non-fractured society, or at least a lot less fractured than some of the other nations in Europe. UK not excluded from that. What am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about bringing people together, hopefully in a good way that's good for everybody and that they actually like it as a change. So let me draw. People at the back, can you see that? Is that clear enough? Yeah, okay. And here we have a fairly simple, somewhat offset distribution, bell curve. And I've drawn it so the peak falls at 1. And along this axis is the effectiveness of organizations. And that's really the context of what I'm talking about every time I have the opportunity to speak, which is organizational effectiveness. It's not about, and I'm not too concerned with, individual teams or groups or departments or functional silos, because actually they undermine organizational effectiveness. It's Akoff, one of Akoff's many pearls of wisdom is that if you improve the part of a whole without reference to the whole, then you actually make the whole worse. It's not just neutral, it's actually you make it worse. So this is effectiveness of organizations, and this is percentage of organizations. An example of?
Example of improving, for example, the software team, how that would, for example, make it all close?
Yeah, a very classic example. I think the one that's come up in several talks today, or several of the sessions today, is developers will go agile or want to go agile. They read all the books. They work hard to make it work. You know, they go through retrospectives and stand-ups and all the 9 yards of agile practices. And then maybe 6 months or a year down the line, they see that even if there had been constraints within their team, they've kind of got rid of those, and most of the constraints or blockers are now in the rest of the organization, and they don't seem to be getting dealt with. So the morale of the team takes a nosedive because they can't get the work done and it's not within their remit anymore. And ultimately that can lead to a psychological phenomenon called learned helplessness. And over a period of time, they keep banging their head against that set of problems, that wall that's somewhere else, to the point where they learn they can't do anything about it. And then they kind of give up. And not only do they give up trying to do anything about those problems, they kind of give up being agile as well, to a large extent. That can happen. I'm not saying it happens all the time. So that's just one example of how it can impact that particular team, but of course it can impact the rest of the organization as well. And I will probably mention a little bit later on the concept of organizational cognitive dissonance. Who here is familiar with the term cognitive dissonance? Okay, that's half a dozen out of what, 100? Cognitive dissonance is the stress or the pain that you feel in your own head by holding two opposing ideas at the same time. So you might think of yourself as a generous person, and then on the street you walk past a beggar rather than giving them some money, and you have some trouble reconciling those two images of yourself. So that's cognitive dissonance, and it's my observation that that happens at the organizational level as well. You know, the organizational, or an organization can have a psyche, a collective psyche, and sometimes, quite often, in fact, organizations can hold opposing ideas within their collective head, and that can generate some pain. And of course, the classic example is, or close to home, is agile adoptions or agile transformations or whatever you want to call them, where the rest of the organization kind of ignores what's going on in the software department till the point they learn what's going on in the software department, like no more project managers, self-organizing teams, people having fun, people being interested in their work, you know, and that seems very alien, and they can't reconcile that. The organization as a whole can't reconcile that happening in that group and the rest of the organization working in the old way or the established way, and that's kind of what I mean by organizational cognitive dissonance. Okay, so why was I mentioning that? Does anybody want to tell me where my thread came from? Because I've lost it. All right, I'll go back to this then. Oh, it was your question, wasn't it? Yeah. Sorry. Were those adequate examples for you? No. Okay, so this is what I call the right shifting curve. And it's not of my original creation, although I've kind of carried the flag for it for the past 8 or 10 years. This originally came out of a book by Steve McConnell and a paper that he wrote to go with it. And he just observed this kind of distribution in the industry at large. So of all the software organizations, or actually applies to knowledge work more generally, of all the organizations around the planet, this is the kind of distribution. So fully, this is unit level effectiveness, whatever effectiveness is, and to me that means being able to, how much effort you put into getting your business goals met. So fully half of the organizations in the world are below 1. Well, that's what the definition of median is, I guess. But there's a long, thin tail off to the right. And there's quite some statistical evidence to back up this model, or at least this distribution. And these organizations up here, as organizations as a whole, are at least 5 times more effective than the median. Never mind this half. So what does 5 times more effective mean? That means they're doing a week's work in a day, basically, every week, or every day. That's like 400 or 500%, depending on how you define it, more effective than these people. Or it means they can do a day's work and then take the rest of the week off. Well, I'm sure a lot of people do that anyway, they just get paid for it. There are some corollaries which follow from that, which is these organizations down here are wasting a lot of their time. They're doing a lot of work, but they're not adding any value. And if you take, again, the median organization, they're probably wasting about 70 to 80% of their time, their effort, their money, their expenditure, their OPEX and their CAPEX, on stuff that's not adding any value from anybody's point of view. Not just the customer's point of view, but from anybody's point of view. But they're still doing it because they're that ineffective. They don't know where the waste is. They don't know what they can stop doing to become more effective. Okay, so that's the basic right shifting curve, and this kind of is kind of like the platform on which I'm going to talk about bringing people together. Because after having drawn this and seen it originally in Steve McConnell's book, and then worked with it and thought through some of the implications, and then held it up as a template against some of the organizations I was working with at the time. I started asking myself the question, well, what are these organizations up here doing that's so different from these people? And what are these organizations doing that's so different from down here? What does life look like and feel like? What is the work, how is the work organized and run and managed across this spectrum that results in these very, very different outcomes? And of course, yes, there are other factors like monopolies and criminal activity and so on. But if we restrict ourselves to what's legal and ethical, just for a minute, okay, that's not the real world, I know, but if we want to improve our effectiveness, what kind of things do we need to understand about the difference along this axis? Does anybody want to make any suggestions? Yep. Employee empowerment. And what would that do to this?
I think it would shift you to the right.
It would shift you to the right, probably. Yeah, I think there's enough research to say that engaged employees, these days I like the term discretionary effort. More discretionary effort from engaged and motivated employees will mean that they're doing more useful stuff and probably getting more fun out of it as well. So that would be moving the organization to the right. Hence the term right shifting, by the way, in case you hadn't noticed that. Anybody else?
Less hierarchy.
Less hierarchy. Yes. More contentious, that issue. Probably less research and also more vested interest in hierarchy, which makes that a more difficult discussion to have. But I believe that's true. Perhaps, well, not least for its knock-on effect. Like less hierarchy means more engaged employees. I'm not going to go into the minutiae of the cause and effect there.
Less or no silos?
Less or fewer silos, or no silos, yeah. Silos, is anybody uncomfortable or not knowing what the term silos is in that context? Okay, just briefly then. Probably the easiest way to think of silos is the different departments in an organization, like HR, finance, operations, logistics. A particular customer order or a customer request has to go through a whole bunch of silos to get met. And that can be the source of a degree of frustration and friction, not to mention separation, which is our little mini theme today. Okay, so you can see that there are a whole bunch of things, and we've just touched on 3 of them. There's a post on my blog from a couple of years ago which has about 27 different dimensions of how these organizations differ across this spectrum. And in fact, that was my first outing of presentation based on the right shifting stuff. And it was that was the question in my mind when I was writing that presentation is, what are these organizations doing differently that determines where they are on this horizontal axis? So I just put down 27 different dimensions which I thought had some kind of impact. And those were 3 of them. A little bit after that presentation, which people seem to like, I then started asking myself the question, along with the dear departed Grant Rule, we kind of sat down and asked ourselves the question, can we simplify that? I mean, we don't really want to spend time talking about 27 different dimensions every time we're like having this presentation or this discussion. Can we kind of break it into kind of rather more manageable chunks? And that's really what I was working on after that for a year or so. And the story of that is on my blog as well. But basically where we got to was a simple more or less observation. We could see basically four different kinds of organization. Down here, the really, really ineffective ones, they weren't long for this world, unless they had a rich uncle or something, in which case they'd keep sponsoring them forever. I've known several of those. But these people basically are really ineffective. And unless they progress to the right and become viable as businesses, then they're not going to like hang around long, because they're not going to be able to sustain their losses for long. I'll get around to labeling these later, but the counter characteristics of these organizations are, in my mind, it's kind of like the mom and pop shop. You know, you have dad and his wife running the business, maybe a few of their kids are also involved, and then they hire in some help. And they run it like it's a kind of extended family, and it's often a patriarchy or sometimes a matriarchy, and every day they do things different because there's no real established ways of doing things. There's no processes, there's no real management. You know, that's what these kind of people are doing. And it's, you know, maybe they can just eke a living out for a couple of years, and maybe they do get a little bit bigger and a little bit better. And then there's the next group, which coincides with the peak, obviously. So the vast majority of organizations out there are in this space. And they're, to my mind, characterized by the corporates that we know and love, the banks, the insurance companies, the government departments. And some of the defining common features of these organizations are a fairly profound belief in command and control, which goes hand in hand with a belief in theory X. Who here has not heard the term theory X? Okay. Theory X and its counterpart theory Y were invented by a chap called Douglas McGregor. Back in the 30s, I think he wrote his book. And he kind of specified, basically there's two types of people working in business in this particular style. There's the theory X people who believe that everybody is idle and lazy and shiftless and needs to be beaten with a stick before they're going to do any work. Is this familiar to you? And then there's theory Y, which is its counterpart. And theory Y people believe that everybody's actually trying to do a good job, and they want to come to work, and they want to do the work because of the satisfaction they get out of the work, and pay is really not so much of an importance. Kind of hand in hand, but it's not what gets them out of bed in the morning. And these are two fundamentally conflicting worldviews. And theory X is alive and well in this space. Also, fairly common in here is lots of silos, lots of departmentalization, and what Akoff calls or describes as managing the parts of the organization in the belief that if you manage each individual part, the organization as a whole will thrive. And we've already touched on how that is a fallacy, or at least if you concur with Akoff, you'll agree it's a fallacy. Many people don't. Many people still believe. In fact, you know, the vast majority of people, frankly, still believe that if you manage the individual parts of an organization or any system, and each part's working well, then the whole thing is working well. This group, this third group, again a little bit further to the right, what do they hold in common? Well, theory Y, clearly, as the counterpart to theory X. They believe in having fun, and fun at work is actually a good thing because it makes people want to work more and enjoy themselves, and that's kind of good for themselves, good for their families when they go home at night, and good for the dog when it doesn't get kicked so often. And generally it's a happier place to be, and good for society as well, because we'd like to see more businesses in this space, I think, for healthier societies. Because these kinds of businesses are more interested in social programs, helping local charities, sending people on outreach work, supporting their communities, maybe paying a percentage of their profits into some kind of charitable funds. And then, oh, I should also mention that this group kind of sees the, understands the, yeah, sorry?
So is there less money in this sector? Or why
less money? No, well, there's more profitability because there's more effectiveness. Why are there so few organizations in this sector? I'll get onto that in a second. Make sure I answer that question, please. And as I said, these people working in these organizations, and collectively these organizations, have a view that to be effective as a whole organization, you have to look at the organization as a whole. You can't just manage individual parts and expect it to work. And then finally, and this was kind of an afterthought in my model, and this is my model, so I actually gave it my name in an act of hubris. This is the Marshall model. That's me. And the other reason I called it the Marshall model is because I was doing consulting at this time, and there is a thing called the Dreyfus model. Who here has heard of the Dreyfus model? About a third, less than a third. Okay, now the Dreyfus model, to give it its full title, is the Dreyfus model of skills acquisition. Was invented back in the 60s to help train nurses and airline pilots. And the Dreyfus model is a 5-stage model, a bit like Shuhari, where you've got novices, and you need to, it's helpful to instruct novices or train novices with an understanding that they are actually novices, and then you adopt certain styles of training or education to suit their novice status, and then all the way up through various levels of capability up to expert. And at each level, people who use the Dreyfus model find that it's handy, beneficial to actually treat people in these different categories differently with different styles of education and different styles of training. So that was the other reason I called it the Marshall model, was because it's a bit like the Dreyfus model, and in fact it's subtitled the Dreyfus model for organizations. Because if you accept this general segmentation, and because there's 4 levels here instead of 5 for Dreyfus, but if you accept this general segmentation, then maybe you can begin to see that in terms of interventions, you'd want to intervene very differently, maybe as a consultant or a coach or a Scrum Master or something. You'd want to intervene very differently in these 4 different kinds of organization. Because the kinds of intervention that are going to work down here in ad hoc, I'll get to the labels. I'm going to come back to the labels right now. I'll write that one in. Giving that one away. The kinds of interventions that are going to work down here are not really going to work in here. They'd laugh you out of the room. And vice versa. You know, the kind of interventions you'd suggest here are not going to fly here because they wouldn't know what the hell you were talking about.
Can you jump the level? Can you go from...
Lots of people ask me that. It's my belief no, and I'll explain why after I've labeled them. Okay, so this second one I call analytic, after, in honor of, not least, Akoff, where the word comes from. And analytic in this context means breaking things down into parts and trying to manage the parts individually. Now, this is also a mechanistic worldview. It's viewing the organization as a machine with neat gears and cogs that spin round and things happen. And seeing people as cogs in that machine as well. This third segment is synergistic. after the Buckminster-Fuller use of the term. Things working together as a whole. And then finally, this fourth group is the chaotic group. Who here has heard the term chaotic before? 2, 3, 4. Okay, it comes from D. Hock, who was responsible for setting up the Visa organization, the credit card people, back in the 60s. And he's written a whole bunch of books about chaotic organizations and why they can be so effective. We did the parrot cage example earlier, so I won't have to do that again. Who did parrot cages? Was that Alistair? Was that Alistair? Do you remember the parrot cage mention? Yes. Okay. Just making sure you're paying attention. Yeah, and one of the few examples of an organization in the software industry that might even closely, vaguely be regarded as chaotic is the people who did the parrot cages, who are Forward Engineering in London. Okay, we haven't got too much time left. I'm happy to overrun, but I shall understand if you want to go. So I'll just go with the crowd, or stay with the crowd. Okay, so we have 4 categories of organization. And what you may begin to understand is that each of these, what I will call collective mindsets or organizational mindsets, is fundamentally different from the next. Ad hoc organizations will not begin to understand how typical corporates run. All of that process, all of that management, all that overhead, all those silos. Why would you need all of that? How could that possibly add any value? We get by just by doing something every day. Just getting stuff out the door, that's great. All that other stuff's overhead, isn't it? Well, it's not, because they're a little bit more effective than these people, but that never got in the way of people having biases and assumptions. Again, similarly, the analytic people are never going to understand the synergistic worldview. Well, never's a long time, but it's going to be a tricky transition to move from seeing an organization as a machine to seeing an organization as a living organism where people are cogs or people really matter. We're talking kind of like really fundamental differences of assumptions here. And again, finally, so coming back to your question, sir, can you skip a level? What's the one thing, there are many things that organizations that make this transformation, and there are organizations that do make this transformation, and back the other way, I should mention, I've seen some of those. Normally are contingent upon a change of chief executive, but not always so. But what's the one key thing that ad hoc organizations that make this transition into analytic actually learn after the event? They can look back and say, oh yeah, we're now an analytic organization. Not that they probably use those terms. And we have learned, since our days as a mum and pop business, a whole bunch of things, but one thing fundamentally we have learned. Size matters. No, I don't believe size matters, but other people tell me different. Makes it more difficult, certainly, but I have seen organizations that are quite big in this way. Like in the order of 5,000 or 10,000 people. So that's quite large. Okay, well, I'm not going to keep you hanging because we're short time. So the one thing these organizations learn in this transition, retrospectively, is the value of discipline. And that's what Alistair was talking about this morning. These people have no discipline. Maybe individually, some of them, maybe they're star players, have some self-discipline. But collectively, they don't really have any discipline at all. They just mess about. And I'm all for messing about, but in a productive way. So these people have gained discipline. Now, the only unfortunate side effect of that is These people believe that discipline has to be enforced, imposed. So they have policies and processes and procedures and policemen to make sure that everybody's doing the disciplined thing. And that's not a great deal of fun. Not only is it a great deal of fun, not a great deal of fun, it sucks the life out of people. And the amount of discretionary effort you're going to get from people who are told to do stuff is much lower than people who are going to be asked to make discretionary effort because they're doing what they enjoy. So when we get to the synergistic people, synergistic organizations, these organizations are much more, they haven't given up on discipline, but they found that self-discipline, like as in self-organizing teams and so on, is a much more effective kind of discipline than the kind that's prevailing here. And I could spend a day talking about why the vast majority of organizations believe that imposing discipline is a good thing, whereas actually it's a bar to effectiveness, it's a bar to progress. But that's not the thing that the synergistic organizations have learned. Again, retrospectively, what do these people learn after they've made a transition from analytic? And your question was, can you skip a level? For me, the one key learning in synergistic organizations is the value of common purpose. Analytic organizations do not have a common purpose. Not exactly by definition, but you could look at most of them and say, well, where's your common purpose? They have individual, collective group purposes tied probably to bonuses. Silos will have maybe a silo will have a common purpose. You know, we're really great technical people, and that's our common purpose, is to be really great technically. Sometimes it may actually relate to customer purpose, which would be even better, but collectively as an organization, they do not have a common purpose, and that's what synergistic organizations do exhibit. It's like we're all in the same boat, we're all going in the same direction, and we know what that direction is. And of course, there are various scales between these. Like these early synergistic organizations are going to be a degree less effective than people who've been practicing it for some time. And then finally, the thing that, again, retrospectively chaotic organizations learn, looking back, is, well, many things again, but for me the key thing is what I call positive opportunism. Because these people can change their business model on a dime. Like overnight they can be in a completely different market, doing completely different things with completely different people and technologies. And that's part of their business model. They develop that capability to be able to respond to arbitraging opportunities in their markets. And that's what the parrot cage story is about. Spot a gap in the market for parrot cages, get in there quick, test the gap, prove the gap, exploit the gap. And because Forward have that capability within their organization, that's why I kind of include them in this space, even though maybe they don't realize it. So come back to your question. Can you jump from an organization that doesn't understand the value of discipline to an organization that's got a common purpose? It's very difficult to execute on a common purpose if you haven't learnt the value of discipline. And similarly from here to here, for different reasons. You know, you probably as an organization have to have that learning. Okay, so we're coming pretty close to the end, and I'd just like to tie this back to the original theme. And I haven't talked about the antimatter principle today. I might have even got away with not mentioning it. And I haven't talked about non-violence and non-violent communication, because these are strategies for building these kinds of organizations, synergistic organizations, are making this transition. It's particularly this transition that's interesting. You've probably all heard the old adage. There may be something similar in Swiss. Do inform me if you know. You can't jump a chasm in 2 leaps. Yeah, is there a Swiss version? Is it an exact translation? I'll leave you to tell me afterwards. But basically, this is a chasm. And although I've been calling them organizational psyches, or collective mindsets. What we're actually talking about in rather more technical terms is meme-plexes. Who here is familiar with the term meme? Rather, who's not, rather? Okay, maybe a third. Okay, a meme is just an idea, like a fashion or a fad or a trend or what is it, like diets. Diets are memes. Each individual kind of diet. You know, the Atkins diet, that's a meme. Whether it has any value or not, whether it works or not, doesn't matter. It's just an idea that's in a whole bunch of people's heads and it spreads like a gene, but it's like an idea equivalent of a gene. So a memeplex is a set of interlocking memes. And the key word is interlocking. They act to reinforce one another. And that's what each one of these mindsets is. They're a set of interlocking memes which act to reinforce one another. So if you try and change any one idea, if you try and get rid of theory X, but don't work on all the other memes in the same memeplex, all the other memes swarm round and oppose your efforts. So basically, what you have to do when you're approaching these transformations, or these transition zones, is you have to swap out the whole memeplex for a new one. And that is no small undertaking. And that's perhaps where size comes in, because the bigger the organization, the more time and effort and money it's going to cost, the bigger risk it's going to be, the more exposed people who are making these kinds of decisions are going to feel. But it has been done. There are examples in the literature where people have organizations have taken exactly this approach. And one of my blog posts is 24 different ways of making a transition. Okay, so there are strategies for doing this stuff.
One reflective question. I learned that chaotic organizations before used to be
synergistic.
And even before they used to be analytic organizations, and even before they used to be ad hoc.
That's possibly true. That's a very difficult path to follow. I wouldn't recommend that. When we set up Familiar, which was Europe's first Agile software house back in '96, even before the word Agile kind of been thought of in that context, we didn't want to be here. We didn't want to build a typical corporate. Okay, we were quite small, but we could see the writing on the wall. We'd all worked in corporates. We didn't really want that. But we certainly didn't want to be ad hoc, because we actually absolutely hated just messing about. All of us, all 6, 7 of us, really like being focused and disciplined and organized. And I guess you could call that a process focus if you like. So by a process of exclusion, we didn't want to be here, we didn't want to be here. We found ourselves wanting to be here. And that's what we built from scratch, not going through these stages, or at least not as that organization. We'd all been through those stages in other organizations previously, separately. But we decided we wanted to start there. And that's kind of really, if I was advising people who are doing startups, and of course startups, lean startups typically, particularly, have a whole bunch of things on their mind, and the culture of the organization might not be the most foremost, although certain companies like Zappos do take it very seriously. But I would advise anybody who was starting a new business, if you're not going to get to it to day one, fine. If there's only half a dozen of you, it's really not going to make that much difference. But if you've got a plan to grow, if you want to be the next Facebook or Amazon, don't we all? Then at least that gives some thought to where you might want to be when you start thinking of yourselves in a particular category. Because where you target is where you're going to end up, at least to begin with. And then if you end up where you don't want to be, say you actually build, and I see lots and lots of startups building analytic organizations by default, because they don't know what they're doing. They're just copying other people. They're cargo culting the analytic mindset. And then if they're actually successful, and they've got like 100, 200 people, a couple of years down the line, they go, oh, this is not a nice place to be, is it? I really wish we'd have actually thought about this before we started, or as we started, and avoided being there. So whereas you can't jump, I'd say, I'd say you can start out where you want to finish. Or of course, you know, there's more room to the right from the synergistic space. Okay, I just wanted to like wrap up with.
Still have a hard time believing that the majority sticks in this analytics sector and all the fun is. People tend to go there where the fun is, where life is, and everybody is stuck in this analytics section.
Yeah, people like to go where the fun is, but how many people settle? How many people go, I actually need a job, and I know this is going to be shit, but I'm going to take it. Yeah? There's a graph on my website which explains this. I call it the Aspiration Gap. This is where the jobs are in this blue distribution, and this is where people want to work. And this is the Aspiration Gap. There's all these people who want to work up there, but the jobs aren't there because the organizations are not run that way. And I tweet quite regularly, there's no shortage of talent, there's just a shortage of talent, just a shortage of companies that talent wants to work for. You know, this is the shortage of companies that talent wants to work for, below that blue line. And this is the talent. Well, because not all of them are really talent, but.
Is it possible that the business people derive their satisfaction from different parameters, like money or other stuff?
Yes, that's a whole another hour. And I'm going to answer that very, very quickly in my wrapping up. So I was attempting in this hour to address the theme of fractured organizations and how we can bring organizations together. And the simple answer is, let's make more synergistic organizations because they're very joined up and there's like very collegiate atmosphere and fellowship is the predominant mode of relationship. Everybody mucks in, everybody gets on with everybody else, and there's a kind of structure underlying that which makes it possible to work effectively. So that would be nice. And there's much less discord and fractured behavior in this space. How do we get there from the organizations we have today? Do we have to rely on senior management to make these decisions to move there? I'd say no. I said if we wait for senior management to make these decisions to move there, we'll be waiting forever, statistically speaking. So there are things you can do, there are things people at the coalface, the workers, the employees can do to at least make some movement in that direction, some movement to the right. We may not be able to effect a root and branch replacement of whole meme sets, but we may be able to do that osmotically, or at least begin the process. And I'll leave you with one thought about what's the most important thing that you could be doing this evening, tomorrow in your workplace to begin that journey towards the right, or to accelerate it if your organization is already on it. And that one thought, that one word is empathy. And if you want to learn more about how that works, by all means talk to me afterwards. Thank you.